Thank you all for attending this talk. My name is Archondakis. I am the Managing Consultant at Pentest People. I specialise in applications, so web, mobile, APIs, written various articles to the British Computer Society and spoken at multiple conferences as well. Today we'll be looking at web application security, having a look at the past, present and the future. The web became publicly accessible on August the 6th, 1991, when Tim Berners-Lee released the first ever public website, which, funnily enough, was about the www project. At this point in time, there wasn't really any need for there wasn't any possibility for functionality within websites. They were just static pages that were displaying text or displaying information. The internet really wasn't built with security in mind, but it probably should have been. Even in 1991, the concept of hacking was known. It goes back as early as 1903, where a magician disrupted a presentation of wireless telegraphy to send insulting Morse code messages, which seems like a fairly amusing first ever hack to me. In the 1930s, we saw the Enigma machine cracked. In the 1940s, Ren Carmile hacked the punch card system that the Nazis used to locate Jews. And in 1941, the theory that actually underlies computer viruses was made public in a paper called Theory and Organization of Complicated Autonoma. So it really does go back in time. Getting a bit closer to present day, in 1971, John T. Draper, who is also known as Captain Crunch, very famously created a phreaking box from a whistle that was found in cereal boxes. A phreaking box was used to emit a frequency that would allow you to have free phone calls. This type of hacking is known as phreaking. In 1981, the first hacker was tried and convicted as a felon. He broke into AT&T's computer systems and changed their internal clock to give people cheaper calls at midday. So the Morris worm, interesting, it affected something called the ARPANET, which was the private internet, the internet that the government had made before the internet was actually released to the public. So this was in 1988, and the worm spread over 6,000 government computers, and he was given a fine and a 3-year probation sentence. This to me is particularly interesting because before the internet had vulnerabilities and it was hacked. It had been seen how much damage could be done through it, yet it really wasn't thought about in any way. Security wasn't really at the forefront of people's minds with websites. I still think this is mainly because at this point all they did was display static text, so it wasn't like you could exploit anyone's session or try and card skim a user that was entering card details, because it just didn't exist at this point. Wasn't really until Windows 98, which was released in 1999, that patches and security updates started being applied to newly discovered bugs. So there were clear warning signs that the technology could be misused. As websites only display static text and they didn't have stateful technologies, no one really expected it. So the difference between a website and a web application is that web applications are more recent. Web applications do have sessions, web applications do have dynamic functionality, web applications do have payment functionalities. They do have areas of code or text that we can actually exploit. So it's created an entirely new threat landscape for us now. Let's have a look at the present. In September 2017, Equifax was hacked with 147 million records leaked. In June 2017, the National Republican Committee had 198 records hacked. MyFitnessPal, which probably affected quite a few people that are even listening here today, had 143.6 million records hacked. These included usernames, email addresses, and hashed passwords. So hashed passwords obviously need to be cracked before you can view them. In June 2018, we had Exactis, which had 340 million records. The Marriott in November 2018, which had 383 million records. Pretty sure they've had another data breach since. British Airways, which was very famous in 2018, had 380,000 credit card records stolen from a client side attack, which we'll get into a little bit more detail about soon. In February 2019, Dubsmash had 161.5 million records hacked, and in September 2019, Zynga had 218 million records hacked. Zynga, if any of you played Facebook Poker, will probably remember that. So, MageCart are a hacking syndicate that exploit websites, usually through the exploitation of a third-party script or through a vulnerability called cross-site scripting, where you can inject JavaScript onto a page. A third-party dependency is just a portion of code that is hosted in another website that's using the application. This is really common for applications in our day and age to be using third-party dependencies, quite often styling dependencies or any JavaScript dependencies are often third-party. The MageCart hacking syndicate typically use client-side attacks to target users. So they were thought to be the cause of the British Airways 2018 attacks that skimmed all the credit card information from those 380,000 people. They're a really, really clever group, and there's a fair bit of research that is going into them at the moment. And yeah, they're essentially using third party packages to compromise usernames, passwords, and credit card information. So who have they compromised? Ticketmaster, British Airways, Magento, and a lot of misconfigured AWS buckets. MageCart is still active. By no means is this a historic attack. That the entire syndicate is still going large, and more information is being found out about them all the time. So, British Airways attack on the MageCart attack on British Airways took place from August the 21st to September the 5th in 2018. It was using an exploitation method called card skimming, which was laying some code or exploiting the third party code on the website to send any details that are typed in by the user on the page back to an attacker controlled management page. It affected over 500,000 customers, and the actual exploit was taking place by changing a third party script called Modernizer to send card details on the fly. So they exploited Ticketmaster, which was again a third party script compromise. This attack took place between February and the 23rd of June 2018. Exploited third party code and affected 40,000 UK customers. There was a lot of personal data stolen this, and it was quite a big story. So, what are we as hackers or penetration testers seeing on the front line when we're testing web applications? We are constantly seeing brute force attacks and password reuse. There's been a lot of education recently towards passwords, which we'll get into a bit more detail for later. But again, we just really haven't got to a point where people are realizing that you need to use different passwords for different accounts. And even worse, we haven't got to a point yet where web applications by standard are having brute force protection on them. So a brute force attack is used to try and log into an account. There are readily available tools online that any 12 or 13-year-old could pick up if they really wanted to. Feed a list of common passwords. The biggest list of common passwords we use as pen testers is called RockU, and it has over 1 billion passwords. Find some valid usernames or email addresses. This is typically done by trying loads of email addresses or usernames against a registration or forgot password function and looking for a different error message saying something like this account does not exist. There are a lot more methods to be used as well. In fact, there are tools nowadays like Dhashed where an attacker can go online and search terabytes and terabytes. I think there are billions of records of leaked credentials and find the passwords related to them to actually try and exploit any of these password reuse attacks. We are seriously missing foundational security best practices, such as just missing security headers, making sure that we have things that stop our application being accessed over an unencrypted connection, making sure that attackers can't lay invisible iframes over our website to trick users into performing actions that they don't know that they're actually performing. There are so many of these flags that have come out now, and they really should just be standard best practice on every single web application that's implemented, especially if you're using any kind of sensitive information whatsoever. Improper session termination. So when when websites became web applications, we had the need to create a session. A session is basically something to stop your computer having to send your username and password in every single request. It'll give you something like a cookie after the first request that tells the server that you have validated and you have logged in, and that you can trust this token as the authentication every time the request is being sent. Not terminating these sessions correctly means that if someone gets hold of these cookie or these access codes, it can be replayed, and access can be granted over that account instantly. And you can go in and change passwords, change email addresses, make purchases. It really depends on what the web application does. Injection attacks, so retrieving database information, running commands on the server. These are still really, really common. We find them in the majority of our tests, especially if applications haven't had a penetration test before. And then using components with known vulnerabilities, which means that using out-of-date software versions. There really is a little excuse now to be using out-of-date software versions. You can go on sites and research them, which we'll get into a bit more detail about, but it's very easy to find out if your software versions are out of date or if they are up to date. And implementing strong and regular patching cycles is a really important part to ensuring that your applications are secure, or even your internal vulnerability systems. And this really is something that shouldn't just be applied to your work ethic. This should be applied to your real life. Using your personal computers, your personal systems should be up to date. Your versions of Word should be up to date. Every software version you should be trying to keep up to date, by either allowing auto updates or checking them, and just ensuring that the applications you use are where they should be. Say, for example, if you're working on you're using your personal laptop at home and it gets compromised and you bring it into the office, then there's a good chance that the office may be compromised after that as well. So it really can take on more effects. The same way that if you take your compromised laptop to your friend's house, it could cause issues for them as well. So what is OWASP? OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. They essentially collect statistics and information that is relating to web application security. They publish cheat sheets for pen testers and developers, so how-to guides for solving a lot of today's web application vulnerabilities for developers. They're really helpful. They often show them in PHP and sometimes even some other comparison languages. If you as a developer are not spending time, as a web application developer, have not heard of, or you're not spending time on OWASP, then you really should start having a look into it and properly reading into it. As penetration testers, we have cheat sheets or how-to guides to exploit vulnerabilities, which also comes in very helpful for developers, because often when you fix any vulnerabilities or you change anything on your systems, you're going to need to check it or test it afterwards to make sure that everything's correct. So below's the link to OWASP. So are we making any actual progress? The OWASP top 10 comparison is the top 10 vulnerabilities that are in the current threat landscape compared every 3 or so years. I think it might be a bit later than that at some points, but you don't need to really pay too much attention to what the vulnerabilities here are themselves in this talk. To go through the OWASP top 10 would be an entirely different, very technical talk. But just notice that they're pretty much the same between 2007 and 2014. At this point, we've got cross-site scripting as the main flaw, which is one of the methods that Magecart would have been using, or still would use today. The OWASP 2013 to 2017 comparison, you'll notice that we pretty much have all of the same vulnerabilities between it. So between 2003 and 2017, we really haven't made any progress with web application security. In fact, there are some areas that are getting a bit better. We'll get into a little bit more detail about that. But in general, in our actual threat landscape, we have not managed to mitigate any of these vulnerabilities. We have not managed to stop these vulnerabilities. They are still here. They are still present. They may have lacked in risk a bit because our defenses got a little bit better. But it just goes to show that we're really fighting a losing battle in web application security at the moment. It's not really in a state where we are progressing and we are making enough changes and we are creating great enough solutions, or maybe we are creating good enough solutions, but people are just too lazy to implement them, or maybe even they don't have the knowledge to implement them. So what are the cause of these vulnerabilities? Developers and sysadmins with a lack of security knowledge is a real problem. The same way that penetration testers or web application penetration testers should be learning how to program and learning how to code, developers should be learning how to hack at the same time. Developers at an early stage of their programming careers should be taught about security and security best practice. And as a sort of ex-developer, as an apprentice, I was never taught anything about security. I was never taught security best practice. We were taught, here's your code, go and learn it. Use Stack Overflow, which I'm sure all developers still do a lot. And you're not really thinking about, what does this code do? What is the logic of this code? Is it being validated correctly? Yeah, it's a real issue at the moment, and training our developers with security in mind from a really early stage will really help them. Lazy programming. So maybe sometimes the developers do know what they're doing. They have complete and full understanding of security and different methods to use and techniques to use to help try and secure systems. But they're just lazy and they don't do it, or they decided that instead of writing a piece of code themselves, they're going to copy and paste something from a random website somewhere that they haven't first validated and really looked into to make sure that it was working. And here, the reliance on third-party code. This is a new problem. This wasn't a problem when we were in the earlier days of the internet. The heavy reliance on third-party packages and third-party code is becoming a lot more common now. So many websites are doing it. A lot of developers are creating their own third-party packages themselves so that they can put themselves out there and people can use their code to create amazing websites. But are you really reviewing your code? Are you looking through your third-party package? Do you 100% understand what all of the code on your third-party package does? On top of that, are you monitoring your third-party package in case they get hacked? What happens if you've done your audit, and even if you're doing an audit every 3 months on your third-party code, what's going to happen if they get hacked and the code gets changed and you don't realize and it's happened a month in? Then you've got 2 more months that you could potentially have Magecart scamming, sort of skimming card details from your application. So we really need to stop relying on third-party code, or we need to start monitoring it and protecting it properly. There are some sophisticated solutions like Rapid Spike that aim to monitor third-party packages for any changes. And if you're using any third-party packages, I really do recommend looking into using some kind of monitoring software like that, especially if you have any card details, payment details, or any sensitive information going through your application. Bear in mind that a card skimming attack isn't necessarily the only skimming attack that will be performed. It could be that the attackers are wanting to steal the credentials of people that are logging into your site. So that's also something to bear in mind. So let's have a little look at what's going to happen in the future, or how I think the future should go for web applications. Currently, we are trying to improve web application security. We have implemented APIs. APIs obviously did exist beforehand, but now they're becoming a standard part of web application architecture. APIs have a content type typically that is different than that allows you to perform things like cross-site scripting attacks or that are also required for card skimming attacks, because it's typically a programming language called JavaScript that's used for these card skimming or cross-site scripting attacks. And if that content type can't actually execute on the page or execute with your request, then it's more or less mitigated. There are other ways around it. There are some extremely convoluted attacks that can be added on to potentially try and get past here. But yeah, it's something that is improving web applications, and I see the future becoming very API heavy, all architectures using APIs. Multi-factor authentication is one of the most powerful defenses that are available today, yet it is not commonly used at all. If you sign up to a third party website and your account is compromised and you reuse passwords, but you have multi factor authentication, they will not be able to get into your account without the multi factor authentication code, which should be something like a Google Authenticator app on your phone. That's not to say that you should reuse passwords, because you absolutely shouldn't, but it's another layer of security to go on top of an already pretty big and serious problem that we have in web application security. Most users to our day still reuse passwords. We often find password reuse as one of our successful attack vectors. We won't even try a couple of hundred different passwords. We'll go and find one or two passwords for an account, try them so that we don't even meet any brute force criteria. And typically, if you have 20 or 30 accounts, you'll get into at least one of them. Brute force attacks, we really need brute force protection to stop password guessing attacks on login pages. And multi-factor authentication code should be treated as passwords. I a while ago did a big phishing assessment for a large company in the UK, and some of their directors had multi-factor authentication enabled on their Office 365. We'd managed to get their credentials through a similar attack to the MageCart stuff, where we were just skimming any text that was put into a page. So we couldn't log in, but at that point I called them and said that I was from IT support, and said I was going to send a text message to their phone with a code and ask them to send it to me or mention it to me, so that I could confirm their identity. And there's absolutely no issue whatsoever in this being done. Web application firewalls are becoming a lot more common now. Whilst they're becoming more common, there's absolutely no point in relying on these for security, because they can be bypassed. There are a lot of different techniques for a lot of different firewalls that can be used. You really shouldn't rely your security on this. Make sure that you're testing your code base of your application, not your firewalls. In penetration testing, we ask for web application files to be turned off so that we do test the actual code base, not the third-party defense that's been put on top of it, that within time will have exploits relating to it. Hosting applications internally so that a VPN is required to access it. This is becoming increasingly common now. It's a very good defense. If it's not available on the World Wide Web, your threat landscape is reduced significantly. Regular penetration testing, or penetration testing as a service, and vulnerability scanning. This is absolutely crucial to any web application or even infrastructure security, that you're performing regular penetration tests. Biannually is typically the recommendation, and then quarterly vulnerability scanning as well. The vulnerability scanning should not be confused with web application testing or any kind of testing. It is merely in place to check for any low-hanging fruit or any obvious changes to the web application. Easy to use applications that detail security vulnerabilities, like CVE details. So if you find all of your internal software versions or your web application software versions, you can go on here and search those software versions, and basically find any exploits that relate to this. This should also be a scary thought for you, because whilst you can do that, hackers can do that, or even 12 or 13-year-old bored children can do that find publicly available code for your software version, aim it at your website, and often just click and press and compromise. Using up-to-date CMS software such as WordPress, Joomla, or Drupal is also very good. These frameworks are tested over a long time. There are a lot of vulnerabilities in WordPress compared to Joomla or Drupal, but this is merely because there are so many more web applications that are using WordPress than Joomla or Drupal. Again, you can search your WordPress version in CVE details to see what's been released so far. We're implementing passphrases over passwords. Historically, a password length of 8 characters with complexity requirements was the recommendation. This is no longer the recommendation, and it's become very clear that actually a longer password over a complex password is much better and much stronger and much more efficient against password guessing attacks, especially in a true brute force attack where you try every single different letter and number combination possible. As you can see in the bottom, there's a bit of a comparison that password 12 would take about a day to crack, whereas super duper secure password with with dashes between take about 27 septillion years, which is an absolutely massive difference. Or even better, add some complexity to your password as well. Using passphrases are a lot easier to remember than remembering an 8-digit or 10 or 12-digit password with exclamation marks and hashtags and that kind of thing in it. Just mix up the words, make sure they have nothing to do with each other, and maybe add some random complexity into there as well. 16 characters is the recommendation for high privilege admin accounts and 10 characters for low privilege. So we're implementing multi-factor authentication. Again, this prevents password reuse attacks, prevents brute force attacks. It's free and easy to use, and all applications with sensitive data should use MFA. And if they are not, we should start questioning why they are not using multi-factor authentication. We should no longer store any credentials in clear text or with any weak encryption methods. There's no excuse for this. You can find out how to store your passwords correctly with a quick Google search. Multi-factor authentication wherever possible. Training developers with security in mind. We need to start keeping up to date with security news and new attack methods, and also auditing your supply chain and third-party code whilst monitoring it for changes. So thank you very much for coming to see this talk today, and I hope you have some questions for me.